My name is Elena. I'm 48 years old, a widow of 10 years, and mother to a son who's now building his own family. Life has been quiet, predictable, and lonely in ways I've grown accustomed to. My days are stitched together by routine: morning coffee on the balcony, a few hours at work managing a small boutique, and evenings spent with books or old movies. People tell me I'm still beautiful, but I see a woman who's faded into the background of her own life. That's how it was until last Tuesday. It began like any other day, or so I thought. After work, I stopped by the Park Cafe, my little haven for tea and solitude. The golden hour was settling over the city, painting everything in hues of orange and pink. I chose my usual spot near the window, overlooking the fountain where children played and couples strolled hand in hand. And then I saw him. He walked in like he owned the sunlight. A young man, maybe in his late 20s, with a sharp jawline, tousled hair, and an easy confidence that turned heads. He was dressed simply: faded jeans, a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, but there was something magnetic about him. His presence filled a room as if it had been waiting for him all along. I told myself I was just admiring him, as anyone might admire a beautiful sunset. But when he smiled at the barista, something inside me stirred, a flutter, faint but undeniable. It was ridiculous, really. I was nearly twice his age, and yet for the first time in years I felt alive. I finished my tea, but stayed longer than usual, stealing glances as he read a book by the window. I couldn't tell you what it was about him that held me there, only that leaving felt impossible. As he gathered his things and walked out, my heart sank. I watched him head toward the park, his strides unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. And before I even realized what I was doing, I followed him. It was foolish, I know. But something about him called to me, and for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I answered the next day. I couldn't stop thinking about him. His face lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't place, his smile replaying itself over and over. I told myself it was just a passing fascination, but deep down I knew it was more. By mid-afternoon, I found myself back at the cafe. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I liked the tea there, that the park was lovely this time of year, but I knew the truth. I wanted to see him again. And there he was. He arrived as casually as he had the day before, ordering his coffee, settling into the same spot by the window, and opening another book. This time, I noticed the small details: the way he tapped his fingers rhythmically on the table as he read, the way his eyes narrowed slightly when something in the book intrigued him, the way he smiled to himself every so often as if the world had told him a secret. I sat at my usual table, trying not to stare. But every time I looked up, my gaze seemed to find him. And then it happened, he looked up, too. For a moment, our eyes met. It wasn't a fleeting glance. It lingered, warm and curious. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly looked away, feeling like a schoolgirl caught daydreaming about her crush. But even as I stared down at my tea, I could feel his gaze on me, as though he was trying to figure me out, too. When he left, I followed again. This time, it wasn't just curiosity, it was a quiet, insistent pull that I couldn't ignore. I stayed at a distance, watching as he wandered through the park, pausing to admire the flowers, chatting briefly with an older gentleman feeding the ducks. There was a kindness in his demeanor, a gentleness that made him seem older than his years. For 3 days, I did this. I watched as he moved through his life with an ease that fascinated me. He went to the same cafe, took the same walk through the park, and even stopped by the same bookstore on the corner. And each time, I found myself drawn to him, captivated by the way he seemed so effortlessly at peace with the world. But it wasn't just him I was learning about. As I watched him, I began to notice things about myself, too. The way my heart raced when he smiled, the way my mind wandered into dangerous territory, imagining what it would feel like to talk to him, to hear his voice, to know his name. By the 3rd day, something had changed. I wasn't just watching him anymore. I was noticing signs that he was aware of me, too. A glance that lingered a little too long, a faint smile when he caught me looking. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And with that realization came a new feeling: hope. On the fourth day, I decided to dress with more care than usual. I chose a soft lilac blouse and a flowing skirt that swayed as I walked. My reflection in the mirror caught me off guard. I looked different. There was a light in my eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a quiet thrill that reminded me of a younger version of myself. When I arrived at the cafe, he was already there. His usual spot by the window seemed brighter somehow, as if he carried the sun with him. I hesitated at the door, my pulse quickening as our eyes met. This time, he didn't just glance at me. He smiled, a smile that felt like an invitation. I chose a table closer to his, though still at a respectable distance. I tried to focus on my tea, but my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Should I say something? What would I even say? My heart was a drumbeat in my chest, each beat echoing the same plea. Don't let this moment slip away. And then, as if the universe had grown tired of my indecision, he made the first move. He stood, walked to the counter, and on his way back, stopped at my table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "I couldn't help but notice you've been here the past few days. Are you a writer, perhaps? You seem so thoughtful, always observing." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His presence was overwhelming up close, his eyes a deep, captivating brown, his expression a mix of curiosity and charm. I managed a small laugh, though my voice betrayed my nerves. "No, not a writer. Just someone who enjoys the quiet here." His smile widened, and he nodded as if he understood more than I'd said. "It's a lovely spot," he agreed. "I'm Daniel, by the way." "Elena," I replied, my voice softer now. "Well, Elena," he said, lingering for a moment longer, "I hope to see you again." And just like that, he returned to his seat, leaving me to process what had just happened. My hands trembled slightly as I picked at my cup, the warmth grounding me. He had spoken to me. He had noticed me. As I left the cafe that day, I felt his eyes follow me to the door. When I turned back, he raised his cup in a silent toast, his smile lighting up the space between us. That evening, I couldn't stop smiling. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the world itself had shifted. I had spent so long believing that my time for this kind of connection had passed, that the spark of possibility no longer existed for me. But now, with every glance and every smile, Daniel was proving me wrong. The signs were unmistakable. He was drawn to me, just as I was to him. And with that realization came a daring thought. Perhaps it was time to take the next step, the thought of inviting him over. Daniel, this young man who had been haunting my every waking moment, was both thrilling and terrifying. The idea had taken root in my mind the moment I realized he wasn't just being polite. He was genuinely interested. But inviting him into my home, into my private, quiet world, where every object, every corner, was a silent witness to the years of solitude I'd lived through, it seemed audacious, impossible even. Still, the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was the right thing to do. After all, we had shared moments, glances, conversations, even the briefest of exchanges that held the promise of something more. It was a Thursday evening when I finally decided to act on the urge. I had spent the day preparing, making sure everything was perfect, though I didn't really know what perfect meant. My home wasn't luxurious or extravagant. It was modest, filled with things that held memories, things that represented my life. The soft light from the lamps gave the room a warm, intimate feel. I was just finishing up with a fresh pot of tea when I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped, and I had to take a deep breath before answering. When I opened the door, there he stood, a little surprised but undeniably pleased. "I hope I'm not too early," he said with a smile. I didn't want to show up and interrupt anything. I laughed nervously, stepping aside to let him in. "Not at all," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "I've been looking forward to this." The moment he stepped inside, I felt a sudden warmth spread through me. His presence filled the room, and everything about the space seemed to shift. I felt younger, more alive, as if something had unlocked within me. We sat down with our tea, the conversation flowing easily at first, light and casual, as we spoke about everything and nothing. It was as if we had known each other for years, The way our words meshed together, the way our laughter felt like an old song we were both rediscovering. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent between us, something deep, unspoken, that was drawing us closer. I caught myself looking at him, really looking at him, and I noticed how his eyes softened when they met mine. His hand brushed against mine once as he reached for his cup, and for the briefest of moments, our fingers touched. The contact was electric, subtle, but enough to make my pulse quicken. "Elena," he said, his voice lowering, growing more serious, more intimate. "I've wanted to ask you something for days." I felt my heart race in anticipation, my mind already racing with possibilities. "What's that?" He hesitated for a moment, studying my face, as if choosing his words carefully. "Why did you follow me?" The question hung in the air, so raw and direct, and for a split second, I felt exposed. But then I realized that the question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to reveal something deeper. Something honest. I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. I didn't know it at first. I confessed, my voice soft. "But I think I needed to know why you made me feel alive again." His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned in, his expression tender, but filled with something darker, something more intense. "You're not the only one," he murmured. And in that moment, with the weight of his words hanging between us, I realized how far this had already gone, how deeply we had already connected, even without understanding it fully. The fear that had initially gripped me started to fade, replaced by something much stronger, a desire to embrace whatever this was, wherever it might lead. I had invited him into my home, but I knew now that I had invited him into my life, into a part of myself I had long kept hidden away. And as our hands brushed again, this time intentionally, I felt the stirrings of something much greater than either of us could have anticipated. The evening drifted on, but the world outside felt as if it had disappeared entirely. It was just the two of us now, wrapped in the warm glow of the living room, the soft hum of the evening's quiet settling in around us. The tea had long been forgotten, replaced by something more intoxicating, an energy between us that crackled like electricity. Our conversation had slowed, no longer focused on small talk. The silence, now, was thick with the unspoken tension between us, the realization that something was about to shift. His gaze never wavered from mine. There was no hint of hesitation in his eyes, only a deep, silent understanding that neither of us had expected this, but that it was undeniable. His lips parted slightly, as though he were about to speak, but then he simply reached out, his hand finding mine with a gentleness that felt like a promise. "Elena," he whispered, his voice low, as if the very air around us had become sacred. I didn't answer him with words. Instead, I allowed myself to follow the pull of his touch, the yearning that had built up in me since that first moment I saw him. Slowly, I stood, guiding him to his feet. We stood there for a moment, suspended in time, both of us unsure of what would come next. His hand slid to my waist, his touch burning through the fabric of my blouse, making my skin tingle. My breath caught as I felt the heat of his body close to mine. And then, as if the world had finally caught up with us, he leaned in. His lips brushed mine, tentative at first, as if asking for permission. But I didn't need to answer. I met him halfway, my lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, slow at first, then more urgent as I felt every inch of myself drawn into him, my heart beating faster, my mind swirling with the rush of emotion. I was acutely aware of every sensation, the warmth of his hands as they roamed over my back, the way his body pressed against mine, the feel of his lips as they traced a path along my jawline and down my neck. I shivered at the touch of his breath against my skin, the rawness of the moment, and the intensity of the connection between us. It was more than just physical. It was a coming together of souls, a meeting of two people who had never expected this to happen but couldn't deny the pull that had been there from the start. Every kiss, every touch, felt like the unlocking of something long buried inside me, a part of me that had been dormant for far too long. I pulled back for a moment, my chest heaving as I looked up at him. His eyes were dark, filled with an intensity that mirrored my own. "Daniel," I whispered, breathless. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he simply kissed me again, harder this time, as if trying to reassure me, to prove that this was real. And in that kiss, I felt the world shift beneath my feet. This was no longer just a fantasy or a passing attraction. This was something deeper, something that was taking root inside me. When we finally broke apart, our breaths ragged, I rested my forehead against his, unable to speak for a moment. The quiet between us was filled with the weight of everything unspoken, everything we had shared without words. "Elena," he murmured again, his voice hoarse. "I need you to know that I've wanted this. I've wanted you for so long." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. All I could do was pull him back to me, pressing my lips to his once more. And in that kiss, I knew that this was just the beginning. That whatever this was, whatever it would become, was something I wasn't going to run from. It was real. And I was ready to reborn at any age, at any stage of life. What I had with Daniel was not some fleeting infatuation. It was a connection that felt deep, enduring, and full of possibilities. Every moment with him reminded me of the woman I had once been and had forgotten in the quiet years of routine. There were still doubts in my mind, whispers of caution about how society would view us, about what people might say if they knew the truth. But in the silence of our moments together, I realized those voices no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth we had found in each other, the way we made each other feel alive, cherished and seen. I had spent so much time wondering if it was too late, if I had missed my chance at something real. But now, I saw that love doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't ask for approval from the world. It simply finds a way. And in Daniel, I found something I hadn't realized I had been searching for: a partner, a confidant, and a lover who saw me, truly saw me, for all that I was and all that I could be. When I woke up beside him one morning, the sunlight streaming through the window and casting soft shadows across the room, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not just for this beautiful man beside me, but for the chance to love again, to risk my heart. I was no longer the woman who had watched from the sidelines, too afraid to take a chance. I was someone new, someone who had embraced love on her own terms, regardless of age or expectations. And in doing so, I had discovered a version of myself I hadn't known existed. A version of me that was open, daring, and ready to embrace whatever the future held. Daniel and I didn't have all the answers, and we didn't know where this journey would lead. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I wasn't afraid of what others might think. Because I had found something far more precious, something real, something timeless. Love had come to me again, not when I was young, but when I was ready. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful part of all.